Okay, welcome officially to the Cresa Hybrid Workforce Strategy Webinar. I'm Jason Jones, as I have mentioned in our lead-in here, Managing Principal and Service Line Leader of Cresa's Hybrid Workforce Services. I'm joined today by Steve Ike and Paul Springer, both Senior Vice Presidents with Cresa. Welcome officially to the webinar. So there's a workforce trend that's happening right now. It's both frightening, but also exciting. Frightening because this trend causes significant disruption for any organization, but also exciting because of its implications for the health or the improving health of the economy, and because of the possibilities that organizations have who go on the offensive to really capitalize on this workforce trends. So I'm going to let the headlines do the talking about that frightening and exciting trend. And it is, as this Forbes article describes, workers are quitting their jobs in record numbers as the U.S. experiences a booming job market. More headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Forget going back to the office. People are just quitting instead. Bloomberg Wealth. Employees are quitting instead of giving up working from home. Again from Forbes. Companies who focus on their workers will win the war for talent when offices reopen. And finally, from the New York Times, how do they say economic recovery? I quit. Quoting from the article, with new opportunities and a different perspective as the pandemic eases, workers are choosing to leave their jobs in record numbers. And here's the proof. This is a chart from the U.S. Labor Department, which describes the number of U.S. workers leaving their jobs as a share of total employment. And this is called the quits rate, which is voluntary separations initiated by the employee, which can really serve as a measure of a worker's willingness, obviously, to leave the job, but by association, their confidence in the availability of another job. A few key numbers for context. The low point of this graph is September 2009, just coming out of the Great Recessions, and hardly anyone was voluntarily leaving their jobs. The quits rate was 1.2%. Then, as you can see, the economy began to improve, and the number of people voluntarily leaving their jobs started to increase as they have confidence about the economy and a job that may be waiting for them. But then the pandemic hit, and the quits rate plummeted to 1.5% in April of 2020. However, coming out of the pandemic 1 year later, in April of 2021, the quits rate has skyrocketed, a whopping 80% to 2.8%, the highest level since at least 2000. In May, it decreased. The numbers just came out. It decreased to 2.5%, but still well above the 20-year history. So, what to do about this? What are organizations doing to retain their talent and recruit new talent in the midst of this war for talent? Well, some are offering raises and bonuses. Some are extending perks such as free Pelotons and Apple products. Others are taking the time to design engaging office environments. Google is a good example. They're building and repurposing office spaces to make them inviting. And they're using these ideas like team pods with highly mobile furniture that can be wheeled into various arrangements, giving their employees freedom of choice in where and how they work in the office. And they're also building these cool outdoor hangouts called teepees for team members. They're trying to make the office an attractive place where people want to come in and basically are willing to do the commute. And finally, many forward-thinking companies are planning flexible, hybrid workforce strategies that leverage what they've learned about remote work over the past year and a half or so, and combine that with the time-proven benefits of an in-place office. Ford Motor Company is a good example. Ford has announced a really progressive hybrid work model for 30,000 of its office-based employees. And quoting from them, they can continue to work from home indefinitely and have flexible hours approved by their managers. And that's coming from a 100-year-old manufacturer in the staid auto industry. I think this quote by Kirsten Robinson of Ford exemplifies their approach and is both insightful and humble. And she says, look, if there's one thing that we've learned over the past 12 months, it's that a lot of our assumptions around work and what employees need has shifted. But what about you all? What assumptions do you have related to your organization's hybrid workforce? We thought it'd be interesting just to poll a few of you in the audience about a few questions related to remote work and the retention of talent. So I'm going to launch the poll here and read the questions. Just answer them as you see them come up on your screen. But basically, after the pandemic, how often do you feel your employees will work remotely compared to before the pandemic? Less, the same, more? But then a personal question. After the pandemic, do you personally want to work remotely more than you did before? Not necessarily will you, but do you want to work remotely more? Not all the time, just more than you did in 2019, let's say. And then after the pandemic, do you feel that part-time work from home is going to be important for your organization to recruit and retain talent? So we're going to give it just a couple of seconds here to see, just for people to have time to answer the questions. And then we will, okay, we've got a very high percentage that have answered. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. And what you can see is, first question, how often will your employees work remotely? Compared to before, more, 75%. Interesting, no one says less, and that's very common with what we're seeing. Second is, do you personally want to work remotely? A large majority are saying, yes, I do, and but there's a few that say, no, I don't. And then 100% are saying this is going to be important for recruiting and retaining talent. Yes, we are seeing that quite consistently when we do this poll and anecdotally in the conversations that we have. So I'm going to stop that and move on. So this really, what we saw in that poll is mirroring what we're seeing from multiple organizations. And the obvious follow-on question is, well, what should be the balance for my organization between remote or office? In other words, what is the right hybrid blend? And when asking this question, it's important to remember that the new reality is, according to multiple surveys, and what we just saw is that at least 70% of all office-based workers want some type of part-time combination of working at home and working in the office, and the remaining 30% are basically split evenly between wanting full-time remote and wanting full-time office. So the next question is, what is the right blend for your organization? And then what are the criteria for a successful strategy to make sure you're not missing anything? What are the unintended consequences you may face? And how do you build consensus for a plan that will be able to provide the organizational support across the key departments of human resources, technology, operations, and finance? And to answer those questions, you need a plan to balance remote with the office. But every plan is going to be unique to every organization and likely unique to each department within an organization. And the problem that we're seeing is that right now, many leaders feel like the person on the screen. There's so many different paths forward, so many different variables to consider, such as different job roles, culture, differing opinions, competing interests. Many of the leaders feel stuck and the organization is paralyzed. It's hard to find consensus on the path forward and determining what is the right path forward. So if you're contemplating a hybrid arrangement and you're interested in answering questions such as, well, what questions should we be asking? Is there a framework to evaluate a hybrid strategy? And what's the roadmap to navigate to the right blend of remote and office? And this webinar is for you. As mentioned, I'm Jason Jones, I'm joined today by my colleagues, Steve Ike and Paul Springer. I've been at Cresa for 18 years, originally as a real estate advisor, but now I exclusively lead two of our service lines, Cresa Business Technology Sourcing and Hybrid Workforce Services. Steve has over 25 years of experience providing workforce strategy expertise to companies like General Electric, Macy's, Procter & Gamble, just to name a few. Paul also has over 25 years of experience working with nonprofit and for-profit organizations, integrating human resources, operations, IT, and real estate. So as I mentioned in the lead-in, today we're going to have about a 50-minute presentation with Q&A at the end. We'll record the webinar and send out a copy afterwards. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You can hover over it and use it not just to ask questions, but also to provide comments, things that you see along the way. Your thoughts, your reaction, experiences that you've had are really, really helpful for our discussion to make this a fruitful hour that we spend together. So today, we're going to address, number one, context for where we are in the timeline of the COVID-19 experience, benefits and challenges of a hybrid workforce, its key elements, and a roadmap to build a sustainable strategy. So we start with context for where we are in the timeline of COVID-19. Phase one was the immediate phase. People were forced to vacate their offices and work from home. Phase two is the endure phase. We've been enduring, leveraging technology, modifying workflows, and working to maintain culture. Phase three will be the sustain and compete phase. That's the post-COVID phase. Organizations will work to sustain new ways of working that leverage what they learned about remote work during the pandemic, but also recapturing and leveraging all of the time-proven benefits of a shared central office. But to get from phase two to phase three, we have to go through a transition. And that is where we are right now. Or should I say, that's where we should be right now. Forward-thinking leaders are there right now, taking advantage of this time to invest and prepare for the future. But before leaders can move forward with a specific transition plan, they've got to ask a key question. And this is a question that addresses the key workforce desire for freedom of choice around where they work, home, office, other, but also when they work. And this key question is one that we suggest that you too ask yourself. And that question is, what is the right hybrid workforce strategy specific to us that will, number one, be reflective of our culture, but also minimize expense and the threat to business continuity while maximizing productivity, talent attraction and retention, and financial results. Those are the key business drivers that inform our planning process for a hybrid strategy. And in order to evaluate different strategies, we start by making sure that we understand the benefits and the challenges. So let's take a look. The benefits of a hybrid workforce strategy combine the best of remote work and the best of the shared office. So at the top of the list for remote working is reduced commute and fewer interruptions. These, of course, lead to increased productivity. Other potential benefits are reduced expense of real estate, employee turnover, absenteeism, and the personal costs of reduced commute, clothes, and food. There are environmental benefits, and employees consistently state their work-life balance is better. On the other hand, the benefits of the office are time-proven, but they've also really crystallized during the pandemic, and highlights on the screen include things that typically occur best in person, such as mentoring and serendipitous moments. But one benefit of both remote work and the shared office is the ability to recruit and retain talent. When you consider that 70%, it's at least 70% of employees want a hybrid workforce experience combining both, organizations will have to offer some degree of flexibility between home and the office to recruit and retain the best and the brightest. However, even with all the benefits of a hybrid workforce environment, there are several challenges to consider and plan for. We're going to highlight 3 scenarios that organizations could be faced with in a post-COVID hybrid workforce environment. And the first challenge is the potential for disparity between teams. Let's take Team A. Team A has a manager who embraces a hybrid workforce, and she's on board with the concept of giving you the freedom to choose where and when you feel you can be the most productive. Periodically, she requires in-person meetings, but they're purposeful and well-run. She focuses on the output of your efforts, not the input of your time. Team members feel a strong spirit of freedom working for her. And then there's Team B. Team B has a manager who doubts the long-term effectiveness of a hybrid workforce. He's uncomfortable managing people he can't see and requires in-office presence, although he does allow remote work 1 day of the week. When Team B looks at Team A, some of them feel constrained. So what's the outcome? Some members may feel jealous and dispirited, and they wonder, can I switch teams? Or worse, should I leave my job? Another potential challenge is the internal division within a hybrid team. And in this scenario, we have in-office team members who are either full-time in the office or majority office. And then we have remote team members who are either full-time remote or majority remote. If the boss spends most of her time in the office, then in-office team members have proximity to her that remote members do not. And this proximity may lead to real or perceived better career opportunities, choice assignments, promotions, etc., and better access to information. So what's the upshot of this scenario? Remote team members feel undervalued and dispirited. Teamwork is reduced, and they wonder, can I switch teams, or worse, should I leave this organization? If you're the VP overseeing this team, what do you do? How do you prevent this scenario? And a final challenge of, or at least today, of our 3, of a hybrid workforce regards how to accommodate multiple employee profiles. And by profiles, we mean how and when an employee chooses to work. For example, profile number 1 are employees who choose to work in the office 3 days and at home 2 days, or perhaps the other way around. Profile number 2 are in the office 100% of the time, but there's a cultural acceptance that if they take an afternoon or a day to work remotely, no big deal. And then profile 3's default location is at home, but they attend periodic in-person meetings and occasionally choose to drop in the office either to work or perhaps to socialize. The challenge is, how do you accommodate all of these profiles at the same time? What are the critical requirements, the organizational structure required to support them? Now, this next slide is really key to the awareness of what it takes to support a hybrid workforce. What should organizations do from the perspective of human resource policy, measuring performance, ongoing training, cultural norms, technology, cybersecurity, and developing a real estate strategy that will support each of these profiles at the same time? Should you even allow all these profiles? Is it any surprise why many organizations feel paralyzed on this topic? Which brings us to another poll. And the first question is, and let me launch this and I'll read it as we go through. What is the most pressing challenge for your organization of a hybrid workforce? Now, obviously, there's not just one, but we're making you pick. Pick just one of the list above. Fairness for evaluations and promotions. How do you do that? Is that a challenge when some are in sight and in the minds of the managers, and others are perhaps remote and they feel out of sight? Or how do you make them feel comfortable and confident that they're going to receive a fair evaluation and have fair opportunity for promotion? Morale and culture of the organization is another. Human resource policies, redesigning office space, unexpected costs. Now, if you have to set everybody up with a laptop at home or provide home office furniture? Are those unexpected costs? How much of a challenge is that? Cybersecurity, collaboration, and marketing. So I'm going to give this a little bit of time for folks to vote. The next two questions are really around your own organization's preparation. Have you determined your future workforce strategy? And what kind of workforce strategy are you considering? So it takes a little bit longer to think through this particular poll than perhaps the first one, but we're going to give it just a minute or two and let people chime in. Okay, we're getting to a higher percentage. Give it just a little bit more. Let a couple more folks vote, and then I'll share the results. Yeah, it's interesting. We're seeing sort of an even split on some of this. Okay, so we got a really high percentage in. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share results. So it's kind of a fairly even split among the three challenges of morale and culture of the organization, redesigning office space, and collaboration. And we often see morale and culture at the top. And of course, being a real estate firm, we certainly understand redesigning office space. Second question, have you determined your future workforce strategy? And a large percent, 75% no, but you have started planning, and that's great. That's probably why you're on the webinar today. And then third, what type of strategy? I think what's most interesting about this is not as much the percentages in the middle of remote, equal, remote office, or office, but that there's 0 fully remote and 0 fully office strategy. And it's interesting that almost 40% said no one size fits all. It depends on job roles. We agree with that, and that's really where we spend our time helping clients and other organizations. So I'm going to stop sharing results and say, you know, it's interesting. We are seeing higher percentages of organizations having developed a strategy or they're down that path, but not all organizations. And those that have, they still face uncertainty over how is this really going to play out once we get into this. And there are questions about whether or not they've considered all of the details necessary for a successful, sustainable plan. They're asking us questions like, so what gaps do we have in our organizational structure to support the strategy? And because of that, we've developed 2 key frameworks that can help you think through this and prepare. And the first framework is called Workplace 2.0. It not only addresses the physical space, but also the other non-space elements that drive a successful strategy. And the first element is talent, then there's culture, the next is technology, and finally, there's the physical space itself. And what's exciting and new about the concept of Workplace 2.0 is that it's not just about space being only about design and location of physical space, but also offering employees the freedom to choose the best location where they feel they can be most productive. And it's this combination of a well-located, well-designed office space, along with the freedom to choose, that together drive employee engagement, productivity, and satisfaction. It's really more about the blend than it is one competing with the other as they're often set up. So let's take them one at a time. The first is talent. You have to determine which job roles are appropriate for remote work and which job functions might be modified to facilitate a virtual process and virtual collaboration when they're working from outside of the office. But next you have to determine who has the personal aptitude for this hybrid environment long term, the going back and forth or working in one place and another, because working remotely, even though we've all experienced this, is not necessarily for everyone. And these personal assessments can help with how to manage and who is best suited for that, especially when coupled with training, which leads to training for managers and employees. Managers benefit from training to better manage teams that at any given time include some people working at home and some people at the office. In addition, the technology that enables remote work is constantly changing, and many employees simply don't know how to use the full suite of the technology that they already have, and training can help with that. And finally, there's eligibility requirements. It's important to these set expectations and provide structure. And organizations can use key performance indicators and performance evaluations to establish and maintain eligibility for working outside of the office in an ongoing basis. Now, culture is the second key element, with trust being the first key component. Organizations must build trust both up and down the chain of command. Second is communication. Good communication, both formal and informal, is critical to keep employees motivated, and this is the key thing. Employment has got to be of higher quality than in the past, and higher frequency. That's something you can definitely control. Higher frequency of communication with employees who are in a hybrid environment. Cultural norms. Part of any culture is establishing group norms, and a best practice is for teams to discuss and agree upon a short list of norms that guide team behavior and build comfort. And you've got some examples on the screen. Again, you'll see this in the version of the webinar that we send out to you. And finally, value and job security are critical. Because those employees who are working out of the office part of the time, they need to feel like valuable members of the team whenever they are working outside of the office, secure in their jobs and not at a disadvantage with coworkers who may spend more time in the office than they do. And finally, there's socialization. Efforts to maintain relational bonds are even more important in a hybrid environment. So on the left are a few ideas that you see floating down to build and maintain relationships among hybrid team members that can be done remotely. Now, for the technology element, I want to introduce my colleague, Steve Ike. As mentioned earlier, Steve has 25 years of experience providing workforce strategy consulting to several large, successful global businesses. And Steve, I hand it over to you.
So Jason, thank you. As we reach into the discussion of technology and the impact on remote work effectiveness, we need to realize that technology, more than tools and platforms, is a resource enabler that can be leveraged to create that on-demand work experience. As we look at how, when, and where people work, whether remote or in the office, or even a combination of these, communications and collaboration platforms are the foundation for that purposeful interaction. Through real-time and near real-time communications, these platforms can be used for anytime, anywhere, one number reach access across multiple devices. And they can be combined to create that shared workspace to meet, collaborate, and share ideas. So as I take a look at the next step in performance management, we need to realize that it focuses on managing productivity rather than activity, and considers three areas: building trust, empowering employees, and driving productivity. And it addresses that idea of, hey, if I can't see, I can't manage, and evolves to, hey, if I can measure, I can manage. So performance management is both a process and a set of tools that organizations use to measure and evaluate corporate performance and employee performance. It helps managers have meaningful conversations with employees and provides everyone in the organization real-time access to that corporate information and the key performance indicators in a visual dashboard. In turn, this helps address those issues faced with the I'm remote or I'm in office in that tension, and it provides consistent and measurable information about productivity, progress towards goals, and driving business outcomes. The third area in document management, we typically think of online storage libraries like Dropbox and Google Drive, and these, when combined with a management tool, they can be utilized to manage content, address security, who's the owner of the document, what's the version of the document, and what's the document control and document lifecycle for things like loan process in a financial services company, or claims management in an insurance company, client files in doctor's offices, or case files in law firms. So it's really, how do we get a handle on the documents and move from a paper environment to a digital environment so everybody can have real-time access to the most up-to-date and recent documents. And finally, in security and compliance, this is the often overlooked and underanalyzed area for remote work. And we really need to be cognizant of that. More people working at home or working remotely with more connected devices provides for others outside of the organization to gain access to critical and secure information. There are technical considerations like a separate wireless network or wireless access for work-related activities, secure connectivity between my device, whether it's a cell phone, a tablet, or a laptop, back to the company office, and then really looking at intrusion detection. And we've seen over the last couple of days and months of things in the news, there are new and non-standard ways that folks are getting in and getting access. So it also involves human factors of decisions that I make with what I'm doing with the data, human error by clicking on the wrong email attachment, and the threats from within and outside, both intentional and accidental. There are physical things we need to consider as well. Looking towards, if you have an office like Jason and I do, making sure that we've got a locked door, that we have a secure laptop, and we think about the areas to address with people overhearing or looking over the shoulder and getting an access to what people are working on. And I'll point out here that this needs to be even more addressed when you have multiple people who are working from home or working remotely in a shared area. We realize that a lot of folks working from home are apartment and condo dwellers, and that has to be taken into account so that we keep our work areas separate from our personal areas. And tying this back together is training and security policy on top of remote work policies that talk about employer responsibility, the IT security, and policies that address web activity, office activity, and consistent training on how to work professionally in that environment so that you don't expose yourself or the company information to those cyber threats. So Jason, thanks for giving me just a few minutes to talk about technology and the impact on remote work.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephen. I do find it interesting in the conversations that we have with organizations how many of them have a lot of these pieces in place and things worked out during the pandemic, but we're seeing a movement towards, we need to optimize now. Or there's this piece that never really did work quite right. Let's fix that now. And then how do we go down the path of doing that? So that's what we tend to see a lot of in our conversations today. It's optimizing what people have in place, and sometimes fixing things where there is an issue. But moving on to the next component, which is the physical space itself. To accommodate employees' desire for freedom of choice in where and when they work, organizations are now viewing the workplace, and they really need to view the workplace as a network of flexible, convenient, and on-demand places. Employees want the option to choose a workplace location where they feel that they can be the most productive for that day, or the location, or even just part of a day, I should say, which means freedom of movement. It's going to be very important going forward, whether between workplaces or even inside of the office. But at the same time, in order to really make this effective, leaders must be purposeful, and that's a key word, purposeful about their frequency and the medium they choose for collaboration. Team leaders need to be intentional about when to use the office versus when to use digital tools for meetings and collaboration. No one ever liked wasting their time in a meeting before the pandemic, and now they're even more sensitive to making the drive in a commute, and then being in a position where it's really not a strong purpose of their questioning, why did I come all this way for this meeting? Leaders are going to have to model the behavior of being organized and prepared and thoughtful about how they make the best use of everyone's time and build a culture of purposeful collaboration. So that's the 4 key elements, but we have a bonus key element, and that is policy. We felt that a clear corporate policy is so important that we included it as the 5th element. And a clear policy is crucial to setting expectations. And as a leader, if you don't set expectations, your employees will set their own, and they will likely be different from yours. A hybrid workforce policy should address eligibility requirements, tools and resources the company will provide for home use, what the employee is expected to provide, expectations for personal performance and participation, as well as what constitutes disqualification from being able to work in a hybrid manner. So now that you've learned about the key elements of Workplace 2.0, you may be asking, okay, but what is the process for getting there? What's the best place to start? So we want to introduce our 2nd key framework for developing a hybrid strategy. And the concept is be sequential to be successful. And it all starts at the top. We believe that the 2 most important elements of success are leadership and culture, and that's the umbrella that overhangs all success. Then beneath that, you've got the fundamental business goals of operational productivity, recruiting and retaining talent, and maximizing financial results. These inform decisions and drive behavior. But to support these business goals, you must follow a sequential path, starting with workforce strategy, followed by workplace strategy and design, and then real estate strategy. Too often, companies skip the human component of the workforce strategy, and they just go straight to step 2 or step 3. So here it is again. Step 1 drives step 2, which leads naturally to step 3. Be sequential to be successful. And when workforce strategy is addressed in this manner up front, it provides organizations the freedom to design your workplace with the confidence that you're basing the design of the real estate strategy on meaningful information. You want to build your workplace design and your real estate strategy on solid rock, not shifting sand. So knowing this, it's important to begin by examining the critical requirements of a hybrid workforce strategy. And we've organized these critical requirements by the different departments of a company to make it easy to understand. Human resources, information technology, finance, etc. And candidly, we believe that this is a key differentiator for Cresa. We don't know of anyone else who starts their real estate strategy by evaluating the critical requirements of an upstream workforce strategy. Each of these departments has several details, and you're going to see them developing on the screen. So this is the checklist that every organization should work through. And we help organizations navigate through all of these requirements in a thoughtful, methodical manner. We're going to send an email out with this list to all attendees, so no need to jot down every bullet point right now. But if you'd like to have a conversation about your specific situation, maybe there's an area that you've covered, but maybe there are areas that you're not sure you've covered or you want a second set of eyes on or just a conversation about, please reach out to us or the Cresa advisor who invited you to this webinar. We enjoy those open dialogues and sharing what we see other organizations doing. So the final question, the one from the very beginning of the webinar, is how do we transition? How should we evaluate all of those critical requirements on the previous slide to develop a successful but also a sustainable hybrid workforce strategy? And we've developed a roadmap that consists of 5 steps to methodically walk you through that process. And it begins with awareness. Learning best practices, we want to make sure you understand the benefits and the challenges of both and of the hybrid scenario. and become aware of the process. Actually, you're doing part of that today. The next 3 steps, Cresa has combined into a workshop that's built on 3 phases. Phase 1 is discovery, which begins with a kickoff meeting. You build your team and establish goals. And then we conduct surveys as appropriate and interview senior leaders of your team to evaluate your organization and perhaps the plan that you have already created or the information that you have already gathered. And in light of those critical requirements, we want to ensure that you have the organizational structure in place to support the plan and make sure you haven't missed anything. Phase 2 is analysis, and here we identify any gaps in the critical requirements and determine solutions to meet your goals. Phase 3 is discovery of an executive summary with, delivery of an executive summary with recommendations to fill those critical requirement gaps, apply best practices, and advise you on your remote work policy. The workshop takes about 4 weeks, and really one of its major benefits is it provides that structured, methodical process for leadership teams to have conversations about all of those arrows that we saw in that original slide where the person was standing there with paralyzed over him. And it helps build consensus about a pathway forward, which gives you freedom to move forward in confidence that you're communicating clearly to your employees. The 5th step of the roadmap is implementation of the plan, and for this we do offer a more robust blueprint plan, which includes everything from our workshop, but a deeper dive into discovery and analysis and follow-on monitoring with feedback over a 60, 90, and 120-day period. So with that, let me offer a summary. The desire for freedom is changing where and when we work. As important as a shared central office is, this desire for freedom of choice requires that most organizations develop a hybrid workforce strategy unique to them, their culture, and their business needs. And to get there, transition is key. Just over the horizon, and for some of us already to some degree, is an open door for all of your employees to return to the office. And how you transition to that hybrid work environment will determine how competitive you're going to be to recruit and retain talent, operate efficiently, and achieve financial results. And finally, be sequential to be successful. Remember, it only makes sense to develop your workspace design and real estate strategy after you've evaluated the human component of the workforce strategy and all of the critical requirements that make it successful. Give yourself meaningful information to inform your decision-making and build your strategies on solid rock, not shifting sand. Now, we've got about 12 minutes left, but there's one last thought that I want to leave you with before we enter Q&A. I was in the Navy for 8 years, flying jets off aircraft carriers. So I know that the Navy is an organization that runs on planning, training, and leadership, especially leadership. Similarly, implementing corporate programs, especially those that involve significant change, it requires the same 3 elements. This is a time of dramatic change, and that change requires leadership to find the right hybrid workforce strategy, to find the right blend that supports your people and makes you more competitive. So be thoughtful in your planning, train your people, and take the initiative to lead them well. So that's the end of our webinar today. Thank you very much. We're going to enter Q&A now, and I'm going to bring up Paul and Steve on the screen. Before I do, I want to make sure I give you a chance. Here's our email addresses. If you saw something or you wanted to follow up with a question or additional information, please reach out to us. Obviously, you can go to our website and look up our names. But I'm going to stop share and bring everybody up and open up the Q&A feature. Stand by. Okay, so question number 1. who is typically included in the workshop that you offer? I think what they're referring to is which members of the organization would we recommend perhaps to be a part of that core team that goes through a workshop. And I'll answer this one. It's very easy. I think we really advise and think it's important that all the different key leaders of different departments are represented. So human resources is a critical one. Information technology is another, the CIO. And then typically someone from finance is involved, but also operations, potentially the CEO. We've had that several times, and any other organizational leader of a major department. Sometimes we include one step down below, but the key is getting representation across different departments, because different departments have different styles of working and different needs. We want to make sure that they are all represented. So that was a fairly easy one. Next is, what are some gotchas, in quotation marks, things that we may not be thinking of, or unintended consequences? I assume this is of a hybrid workforce strategy and a plan. So Paul, I'm going to let you field that one first. And Steve, I'm sure you have some ideas also, but what are some gotchas out there that people should be aware of?
Sure. So one thing that everyone needs to consider is when you have a hybrid structure, not only are you allowing people to work remote and work in the office, the reality is that you have a dispersed team that potentially could be anywhere. So as a result of that, you've got people that could be in other states, in other locations, even in other countries potentially. So there's potentially out-of-date work contracts or employment agreements. There's OSHA standards, benefit laws, employment laws, labor laws that you want to consider. There's also information security issues. If people are working out of the office, or they're working from their home, from a library, from Starbucks, you know, there's those potential issues of the data security and security of what you're working on in general. And then there's other areas, just tax regulations focused on, you know, payroll issues, compensation, even things like immigration laws that you may want to consider as you're looking at these gotchas with this dispersed team.
Gotcha. Very good. Gotcha. Steve, any further comments? I think that's really good, because there are some unintended consequences here of potentially, you know, a lot of folks want to hire people who are perhaps not in their metro area because now they can, and they deal with some issues there. But anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add, you know, Paul, you mentioned, and it's very important to know that each state kind of has their different regulations on remote work and how employees are treated. So there are some compliance issues. I'm going to bring it back to the engaged employee. As you're going through and you're putting your plan together, Jason mentioned communication. And it's really a two-way street. I think you will be significantly benefited by involving, through surveys and conversations and soliciting feedback from a cross-functional and cross-sectional team of your organization, so that they are participatory in part of this planning and the structure. Because when you get the buy-in and the involvement from a cross-functional group, they're part of the conversation, they're part of the decision, they're involved and engaged, and it will help you significantly with not only the adoption of your plan, because if it comes as a top-down, here's what we decided and here's what you're going to do, you will get pushback. But if they're involved in it and they're aware of it and they feel like they were participants in, all of a sudden your employee engagement and buy-in and longevity is there, and they become champions, almost net promoters of your remote work policy.
So that's interesting, because another question has come in, I think that addresses that. It's how do we create a policy that meets the needs of both employees and the company? And so, Steve, you addressed that there by including them. But I think this also leads to a question that we've gotten several times before, which is, and I want you to be able to answer that also, how do you create a policy that meets the needs of both employees and the company? But what happens when the company decides to go in a direction that maybe those employees who were involved in the process aren't a big fan of? How do you address that?
Is that towards me or Paul? You know,
That's go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, first you need to define the requirements and getting the buy-in, or what are the requirements, and having a very honest and direct conversation, not only from the top leadership, but from managers to their teams of, we're here to, as an organization, make money, save money, and serve clients, very well, no matter what your job is. You're all in some type of work towards the organism. So it's communicating, it's listening feedback, but when the hard decisions are made, are who's going to work, where, when, how often, and with what teams, because you're either full-time in the office, full-time remote, or a blend of the two. You're working towards that. Everybody was involved in the process, and communicating back what you found through your surveys and why you made the decisions that you made.
Yeah, it's about communication. Sounds like to me. Paul, anything you had to add to that about a policy that meets the needs of both employees and employers?
I'm going to touch on what was just mentioned around having an appropriate communication plan and a change management plan around the messaging around the needs of the business overall, because ultimately everyone works for a business because they're trying to all achieve a common goal. But you also want to make sure that, as Steve is saying, you bring employees along for the process and make sure that everyone's involved. But the end client and the customers are really a top priority. So you want to make sure that there's a balance of both, and that's part of your communication and change management plan.
Gotcha. And this is a follow-up to the question about what are some gotchas that, Paul, you addressed originally. So in light of those gotchas, what can we do to prevent unintended consequences? Basically, it sounds like the problems that might result from those gotchas. How do we avoid them? I think is what this is asking. How do we avoid the gotchas?
I can take that one. So, yeah. I think Jason, as part of your presentation, you covered that in a couple of the slides, which is really making sure that you proactively have a plan, that you don't go into this blind and you take advantage of and consider all of the components that we've been talking about in the Q&A piece here and also in the presentation. You want to make sure that you really proactively plan, you have that remote policy written and communicated well to the employees, and have that be aligned with the corporate culture overall. You want to make sure that you consider those gotcha focus areas we talked about. Make sure that you are already proactively focusing on those areas, those contracts that you may need to update, those locations that you may not be set up in from a payroll and tax perspective, that if you know that you're going to allow people to work from anywhere, you can proactively set up those states in your payroll process so you're not scrambling when someone moves to California or to wherever. And so for me, there's a lot of different components we've talked about, but really that proactive planning is important.
Well, and a shameless plug here, but one way to avoid the gotchas is to hire an expert to guide you through making sure that you're going through the checklist. And that's the critical requirements. And that's why we created that for our clients. So,
and Jason, Paul mentioned change management, and any successful change management plan, when you define your goals, define your success criteria for those goals, more times than not, we've seen organizations that put a plan into place, but they never circle back 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months later to say, all right, these were our defined goals. Here were our success criteria. How are we doing against that? And what tweaks and adjustments do we need to make?
Yeah, I think that's another good point, is to avoid the unintended consequences. This is an iterative process. In fact, one of the quotes from Kirsten, the chief people officer at Ford, was, we don't expect this to be a one-time evolution here. In fact, we expect this to be an evolving process for us where we're going to recalibrate over time. And I think that's really wise. And that is an important part of this. Whatever you put in place, whatever plan you have, go back and check in, or get a third-party set of eyes on it to see what other best practices there are out there or things you may be missing. So it's now the top of the hour, and we'll wrap it up here. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We really appreciate your attention, and look for an email it'll come from my email address with a copy of the recording. Forward that to someone that you may feel is interested, and please circle back with questions. We'd love to have a conversation with you. So thank you again for joining us.